reviewed by Kate Redding and Michael Kramer.
The sweetness of victory and the bitterness of defeat are like a knife of dreams. From Fog and Steel by Matt Madron. Prologue. Embers falling on dry grass. The sun, climbing toward mid-morning, stretched Galad's shadow and thus his three armored companions ahead of them as they trotted their mounts down the road that ran straight through the forest, dense with oak and leatherleaf, pine and sourgum, most showing the red of spring growth. He tried to keep his mind empty, still, but small things kept intruding. The day was silent, save for the thud of their horses' hooves. No bird sang on a branch, no squirrel chittered. Too quiet for the time of year, as though the forest held its breath.
Okay.
This had been a major trade route once, long before Amadisia and Terabon came into being, and bits of ancient paving stone sometimes studded the hard-packed surface of yellowish clay. A single farm cart far ahead behind a plodding ox was the only sign of human life now besides themselves. Trade had shifted far north. Farms and villages in the region dwindled, and the fabled lost mines of Aelgar remained lost in the tangled mountain ranges that began only a few miles to the south. Dark clouds massing in that direction promised rain by afternoon if their slow advance continued. A red-winged hawk quartered back and forth along the border of the trees, hunting the fringes, as he himself was hunting, but at the heart, not on the fringes. The manor house that the Shonen had given Eamon came into view, and he drew rein, wishing he had a helmet strap to tighten for excuse. Instead, he had to be content with rebuckling his sword belt, pretending that it had been sitting wrong. There had been no point to wearing armor. If the morning went as he hoped, he would have had to remove breastplate and mail in any case, and if it went badly, armor would have provided little more protection than his white coat. Formerly a deep country lodge of the King of Amadisia, the building was a huge blue-roofed structure studded with red-painted balconies, a wooden palace with wooden spires at the corners atop a stone foundation, like a low, steep-sided hill. The outbuildings, stables and barns, workmen's small houses and craftsfolk's workshops, all hugged the ground in the wide clearing that surrounded the main house, but they were nearly as resplendent in their blue and red paint. A handful of men and women moved around them, tiny figures yet at this distance, and children were playing under their elders' eyes, an image of normality where nothing was normal. His companions sat their saddles in their burnished helmets and breastplates, watching him without expression. Their mounts stamped impatiently, the animals' morning freshness not yet worn off by the short ride from the camp. "It's understandable if you're having second thoughts, Dummerdred," Trom said after a time. "It's a harsh accusation, bitter as gall, but—" "No second thoughts for me," Galad broke in. His intentions had been fixed since yesterday. He was grateful, though. Trom had given him the opening he needed. They had simply appeared as he rode out, falling in with him without a word spoken. There had seemed no place for words then. "But what about you three? You're taking a risk coming here with me. A risk you have no need to take. However the day runs, there will be marks against you. This is my business, and I give you leave to go about yours." Too stiffly said, but he could not find words this morning or loosen his throat. The stocky man shook his head. "The law is the law, and I might as well make use of my new rank." The three golden star-shaped knots of a captain sat beneath the flaring sunburst on the breast of his white cloak. There had been more than a few dead at Jeramel, including no fewer than 3 of the Lord's captain. They had been fighting the Shonen men, not allied with them. "I've done dark things in service to the light," gaunt-faced Biar said grimly, his deep-set eyes glittering as though at a personal insult. "Dark as moonless midnight. And likely I will again. But some things are too dark to be allowed." He looked as if he might spit. "That's right," young Bornholf muttered, scrubbing the gauntleted hand across his mouth. The lad always thought of him as young, though the man lacked only a few years on him. Dane's eyes were bloodshot, He had been at the brandy again last night. If you've done what's wrong, even in service to the light, then you have to do what's right to balance it. VR grunted sourly. Likely that was not the point he had been making. Very well, Galal said, but there's no fault to any man who turns back. My business here is mine alone. Still, when he heeled his bay gelding to a canter, he was pleased to have them gallop to catch him and fall in alongside, white cloaks billowing behind. He would have gone on alone, of course, yet their presence might keep him from being arrested and hanged out of hand. Not that he expected to survive in any case. What had to be done, no matter the price. The horses' hooves clattered loudly on the stone ramp that climbed to the manor house, so every man in the broad central courtyard turned to watch as they rode in. 50 of the children in gleaming plate and mail and conical helmets, most mounted, with cringing, dark-coated Amadisian grooms holding animals for the rest. The inner balconies were empty except for a few servants who appeared to be washing while attending the sweep. 6 questioners, big men with the scarlet shepherd's crook upright behind the sun flare on their cloaks, stood close around Rada Masunawa like a bodyguard, away from the others. The hand of the light always stood apart from the rest of the children, a choice the rest of the children approved. Gray-haired Asunawa, his sorrowful face making VR look fully fleshed, was the only child present not in armor, and his snowy cloak carried just the brilliant red crook, another way of standing apart. But aside from marking who was present, the lad had eyes for only one man in the courtyard. Asunawa might have been involved in some way, that remained unclear. Yet only the Lord Captain Commander could call the High Inquisitor to account. Eamon Volda was not a large man, but his dark, hard face had the look of one who expected obedience as his due. As the very least, he was due. Standing with his booted feet apart and his head high, command in every inch of him, he wore the white and gold tabard of the Lord Captain Commander over his gilded breast and back plates, a silk tabard more richly embroidered than any Pedron Nile had worn. His white cloak, the flaring sun marge on either breast and thread of gold, was silk as well, and his gold-embroidered white coat. The helmet beneath his arm was gilded and worked with the flaring sun on the brow, and a heavy gold ring on his left hand, worn outside his steel-backed gauntlet, held a large yellow sapphire carved with the sunburst, another mark of favor received from the Shan-Chan. Volda frowned slightly as Galad and his companions dismounted and offered their salutes arm across the chest. Obsequious grooms came running to take their reins. "Why aren't you on your way to Nassad, Trum?" Disapproval colored Volda's words. "The other lord's captain will be halfway there by now." He himself always arrived late when meeting the Shan-Chan, perhaps to assert that some shred of independence remained to the children. Finding him already preparing to depart was a surprise. This meeting must be very important. But he always made sure the other high-ranking officers arrived on time, even when that required setting out before dawn. Apparently, it was best not to press their new masters too far. Distrust of the children was always strong in the Shan-Chan. Trum displayed none of the uncertainty that might have been expected from a man who had held his present rank barely a month. "An urgent matter, my Lord Captain Commander," he said smoothly, making a very precise bow, neither a hair deeper nor higher than protocol demanded. "A child of my command charges another of the children with abusing a female relative of his, and claims the right of trial beneath the light, which by law you must grant or deny." "A strange request, my son," Asunawa said, tilting his head quizzically above clasped hands before Balder could speak. Even the High Inquisitor's voice was doleful. He sounded pained at Trum's ignorance. His eyes seemed dark hot coals in a brazier. "It was usually the accused who asked to give the judgment to swords, and I believe usually when he knew the evidence would convict him. In any case, trial beneath the light has not been invoked for nearly 400 years. Give me the accused's name, and I will deal with the matter quietly." His tone turned chill as a sunless cavern in winter, though his eyes still burned. We are among strangers, and we cannot allow them to know that one of the children is capable of such a thing. The request was directed to me, Asinawa, Balder snapped. His glare might as well have been open hatred. Perhaps it was just dislike of the other man's breaking in. Flipping one side of his cloak over his shoulder to bear his ring-filled sword, he rested his hand on the long hilt and drew himself up. Always one for the grand gesture, Balder raised his voice so that even people inside probably heard him, and declaimed rather than merely spoke. I believe many of our old ways should be revived, and that law still stands. It will always stand as written of old. The light grants justice because the light is justice. Inform your man he may issue his challenge Trom and face the one he accuses sword to sword. If that one tries to refuse, I declare that he has acknowledged his guilt and order him hanged on the spot, his belongings and rank forfeit to his accuser, as the law states. I have spoken. That with another scowl for the High Inquisitor. Maybe there really was hatred there. Trom bowed formally once more. You have informed him yourself, my Lord Captain Commander. Damodred? Galad felt cold. Not the cold of fear, but of emptiness. When Dane drunkenly let slip the confused rumors that had come to his ears, when Viar reluctantly confirmed they were more than rumors, rage had filled Galad, a bone-burning fire that nearly drove him insane. He had been sure his head would explode if his heart did not burst first. Now he was ice, drained of any emotion. He also bowed formally. Much of what he had to say was said in the law, yet he chose the rest with care, to spare as much shame as possible to a memory he held dear. Eamon Volda, child of the light, I call you to trial beneath the light for unlawful assault on the person of Morgase Trakan, Queen of Andor, and for her murder. No one had been able to confirm that the woman he regarded as his mother was dead, yet it must be so. A dozen men were certain she had vanished from the Fortress of the Light before it fell to the Shonchan, and as many testified she had not been free to leave of her own will. Balder displayed no shock at the charge. His smile might have been intended to show regret over Galad's folly in making such a claim, yet contempt was mingled in it. He opened his mouth, but Asinawa cut in once more. This is ridiculous, he said in tones more of sorrow than of anger. Take the fool and we'll find out what dark friend plot to discredit the children he is part of. He motioned, and two of the hulking questioners took a step toward Galad, one with a cruel grin, the other blank-faced, a workman about his work. Only one step, though. A soft rasp repeated around the courtyard as children eased their swords in their scabbards. At least a dozen men drew entirely, letting their blades hang by their sides. The Amadisian grooms hunched in on themselves, trying to become invisible. Likely they would have run had they dared. Asinawa stared around him, thick eyebrows climbing up his forehead in disbelief, knotted fists gripping his cloak. Strangely, even Balder appeared startled for an instant. Surely he had not expected the children to allow an arrest after his own proclamation. If he had, he would cover quickly. You see, Asinawa, he said almost cheerfully, the children follow my orders and the law. Not a questioner's whims. He held out his helmet to one side for someone to take. I deny your preposterous charge, young Galad, and throw your foul lie in your teeth. For it is a lie, or at best a mad acceptance of some malignant rumor started by dark friends or others who wish the children ill. Either way, you have defamed me in the vilest manner, so I accept your challenge to trial beneath the light, where I will kill you. That barely squeezed into the ritual, but he had denied the charge and accepted the challenge. It would suffice. Realizing that he still held the helmet in an outstretched hand, Balder frowned at one of the dismounted children, a lean Saldaean named Kashgar, until the man stepped forward to relieve him of it. Kashgar was only an under-lieutenant, almost boyish despite a great hooked nose and thick mustaches like inverted horns, Yet he moved with open reluctance, and Balda's voice was dark and acrid as he went on, unbuckling his sword belt and handing that over too. Take a care with that, Kashgar. It's a heron-marked blade. Unpinning his silk cloak, he let it fall to the paving stones, followed by his tabard, and his hands moved to the buckles of his armor. It seemed that he was unwilling to see if others would be reluctant to help him. His face was calm enough, except that angry eyes promised retribution to more than Galad. Your sister wants to become Aes Sedai, I understand, Damodred. Perhaps I understand precisely where this originated. There was a time I would have regretted your death, but not today. I may send your head to the White Tower so the witches can see the fruit of their scheme. Worry creasing his face, Dane took the lad's cloak and sword belt, and stood shifting his feet as though uncertain he was doing the right thing. Well, he had been given his chance, and it was too late to change his mind now. Bayar put a gauntleted hand on Galad's shoulder, being close. He likes to strike at the arms and legs, he said in a low voice, casting glances over his shoulder at Balda. From the way he glared, some matter stood between them. Of course, that scowl differed little from his normal expression. He likes to bleed an opponent until the man can't take a step or raise his sword before he moves for the kill. He's quicker than a viper, too, but he'll strike at your left most often than expected from you. Galad nodded. Many right-handed men found it easier to strike so, but it seemed an odd weakness in a blade master. Gareth Bryn and Henry Haslin had made him practice alternating which hand was uppermost on the hilt so he would not fall into that. Strange that Balda wanted to prolong a fight, too. He himself had been taught to end matters as quickly and cleanly as possible. My thanks, he said, and the hollow-cheeked man made a dour grimace. Bayar was far from likable, and he himself seemed to like no one save young Bornhold. Of the three, his presence was the biggest surprise, but he was there, and that counted in his favor. Standing in the middle of the courtyard, in his gold-worked white coat, with his fists on his hips, Balda turned in a tight circle. Everyone move back against the walls, he commanded loudly. Horseshoes rang on the paving stones as the children and the grooms obeyed. Asinawa and his questioners snatched their animals' reins, the High Inquisitor wearing a face of cold fury. Keep the middle clear. Young Damodred and I will meet here. Forgive me, my lord Captain Commander, Tom said with a slight bow. But since you are a participant in the trial, you cannot be arbiter. Aside from the High Inquisitor, who by law may not take part, I hold the highest rank here after you. So, with your permission, Balda glared at him, then stalked over to stand beside Kashgar, arms folded across his chest. Ostentatiously, he tapped his foot, impatient for matters to proceed. Galad sighed. If the day went against him, as seemed all but certain, his friend would have the most powerful man in the children as his enemy. Likely Trom would have had in any event, but more so now. Keep an eye on them, he told Bornhold, nodding toward the questioners, clustered on their horses near the gate. Asinawa's underlings still ringed him like bodyguards, every man with a hand on his sword hilt. Why? Even Asinawa can't interfere now. That would be against the law. It was very hard not to sigh again. Young Dane had been a child far longer than he, and his father had served his entire life, but the man seemed to know less of the children than he himself had learned. To questioners, the law was what they said it was. Just watch them. Trom stood in the center of the courtyard with his bared sword raised overhead, laid parallel to the ground, and unlike Balda, he spoke the words exactly as they were written. Under the light, we are gathered to witness trial beneath the light, the sacred right of any child of the light. The light shines on truth, and here the light shall illuminate justice. Let no man speak save he who has legal right, and let any who seek to intervene be cut down summarily. Here justice will be found under the light by a man who pledges his life beneath the light, by the force of his arm and the will of the light. The combatants will meet unarmed where I now stand, he continued, lowering the sword to his side, and speak privately for their own ears alone. May the light help them find words to end this sort of bloodshed, for if they do not, one of the children must die this day, his name stricken from our rolls, and anathema declared on his memory. Under the light it will be so. As Trom strode to the side of the courtyard, Balda moved toward the center in the walking stance called Cat Crosses the Courtyard, an arrogant saunter. He knew there were no words to stop blood being shed. To him, the fight had already begun. Gilad merely walked out to meet him. He was nearly a head taller than Balda, but the other man held himself as though he were the larger and confident of victory. His smile was all contempt this time. Nothing to say, boy. Small wonder, considering that a blade master is going to cut your head off in about 1 minute. I want one thing straight in your mind before I kill you, though. The wench was hale the last time I saw her, and if she's dead now, I'll regret it. That smile deepened both in humor and disdain. She was the best ride I ever had, and I hope to ride her again one day. Red-hot searing fury sounded inside Gilad, but with an effort, he managed to turn his back on Balda and walk away, already feeding his rage into an imagined flame, as his two teachers had taught him. A man who fought in a rage died in a rage. Floating in emptiness, he drew his sword from the scabbard one held proper, and the slightly curved blade became a part of him. What did he say? They asked. For a moment there, your face was murderous. Liard ripped Dane's arm. Don't distract him, he muttered. Gilad was not distracted. Every creak of saddle leather was clear and distinct, every ringing stamp of hoof on paving stone. He could hear flies buzzing 10 feet away as though they were at his ear. He almost thought he could see the movements of their wings. He was one with the flies, with the courtyard, with the two men. They were all part of him, and he could not be distracted by himself. Balda waited until he turned before drawing his own weapon on the other side of the courtyard. A flashy move, the sword blurring as it spun in his left hand, leaping to his right to make another blurred wheel in the air before settling upright and rock steady before him in both hands. He started forward once more and Cat crosses the courtyard. Raising his own sword, Gilad moved to meet him, without thought assuming a walking stance, perhaps influenced by his state of mind. Emptiness, it was called, and only a trained eye would know that he was not simply walking. Only a trained eye would see that he was in perfect balance, every heartbeat. Balda had not gained that Aaron Mark sword by favoritism. 5 blade masters had sat in judgment of his skills and voted unanimously to grant him the title. The vote always had to be unanimous. The only other way was to kill the bearer of a Heron Mark blade in fair combat, one-on-one. Balda had been younger than Gilad was now. It did not matter. He was not focused on Balda's death. He was focused on nothing. But he intended Balda's death if he had to sheathe the sword, willingly welcoming that Heron Mark blade in his flesh to achieve it. He accepted that it might come to that. Balda wasted no time with maneuvering. The instant he was within range, plucking the low-hanging apple flashed toward Gilad's neck like lightning, as though the man truly did intend to have his head in the first minute. There were several possible responses, all made instinct by hard training, but Liar's warnings floated in the dim recesses of his mind, and also the fact that Balda had warned him of this very thing. Warned him twice. Without conscious thought, he chose another way, stepping sideways and forward just as plucking the low-hanging apple became the leopard's caress. Balda's eyes widened in surprise as his stroke missed Gilad's left thigh by inches, widened more as parting the silk lit a gash down his right forearm. But he immediately launched into the dove takes flight, so fast that Gilad had to dance back before his blade could bite deeply, barely fending off the attack with kingfisher circles the pond. Back and forth they danced the forms, gliding this way, then that, across the stone paving. Lizard in a thorn bush met lightning of 3 prongs. Leaf on the breeze countered eel among the lily pads, and 2 hares leaping met the hummingbird kisses the honey rose. Back and forth as smoothly as a demonstration of the forms. The log tried attack after attack, but Balder was as fast as a viper. The woodgrouse dances cost him a shallow gash on his left shoulder, and the red hawk takes a dove, another on the left arm, slightly deeper. River of Light might have taken the arm completely had he not met the draw cut, with a desperately quick rein in the high wind. Back and forth, blades flashing continuously, filling the air with the clash of steel on steel. How long they fought he could not have said. There was no time, only the moment. It seemed that he and Balder moved like men under water, their motions slowed by the drag of the sea. Sweat appeared on Balder's face, but he smiled with self-assurance, seemingly untroubled by the slash on his forearm, still the only injury he had taken. Galad could feel the sweat
Hey,
rolling down his
Ozark,
own
how you
face too,
doing?
stinging his eyes, and the blood trickling down
How's
his
your
arm.
evening going?
Those wounds would slow him eventually, perhaps already had, but he had taken 2 on his left thigh, and both were more serious. His foot was wet in his boot from those, and he could not avoid a slight limp that would grow worse with time. If Balder was to die, it must be soon. Deliberately, he drew a deep breath, then another through his mouth, another. Let Balder think he was becoming winded. His blade lanced out and threading the needle, aimed at Balder's left shoulder, and not quite as fast as it could have been. The other man countered easily with the swallow takes flight, sliding immediately into the lion springs. That took a 3rd bite in
No,
his
just
thigh.
tanks.
He dared
Oh,
not
yeah.
be faster in defense than in attack. Again he launched, threading the needle at Balder's shoulder, and again, all the while gulping air through his mouth. Only luck kept him from taking more wounds in those exchanges. Or perhaps the light really did shine on this fight. Balder's smile widened. The man believed him on the edge of his strength, exhausted and fixated. As Galad began threading the needle too slowly for the 5th time, the other man's sword started the swallow takes flight in an almost perfunctory manner. Summoning all the quickness that remained to him, Galad altered his stroke, and reaping the barley sliced across Balder just beneath his ribcage. For a moment it seemed that the man was unaware he had been hit. He took a step, began what might have been stones falling from the cliff. Then his eyes widened and he staggered, the sword falling from his grip to clatter on the paving stones as he sank to his knees. His hands went to the huge gash across his body as though trying to hold his insides within him, and his mouth opened, glassy eyes fixed in Galad's face. Whatever he intended to say, it was blood that poured out over his chin. He toppled onto his face and lay still. Automatically, Galad gave his blade a rapid twist to shake off the blood staining its last inch, then bent slowly to wipe the last drops onto Balder's white coat. The pain he had ignored now flared. His left shoulder and arm burned. His thigh seemed to be on fire. Straightening took effort. Perhaps he was nearer exhaustion than he had thought. How long had they fought? He had thought he would feel satisfaction that his mother had been avenged, but all he felt was emptiness. Balder's death was not enough. Nothing except Morgastrand alive again could be enough. Suddenly he became aware of a rhythmic clapping, and looked up to see the children, each man slapping his own armored shoulder in approval. Every man. Except Asunawa and the questioners. They were nowhere to be seen. The Yar hurried up, carrying a small leather sack, and carefully potted the slashes in Galad's coat sleeve. "Those will need sewing," he muttered, "but they can wait." Kneeling beside Galad, he took rolled bandages from the sack and began winding them around the gashes in his thigh. "These need sewing too, but this will keep you from bleeding to death before you can get it." Others began gathering around, offering congratulations, men afoot in front, those still mounted behind. None gave the corpse a glance except Kashgar, who cleaned Balder's sword on that already blood-stained coat before sheathing it. "Where did Asunawa go?" Galad asked. He left as soon as you cut Valda the last time, Dane replied uneasily. He'll be heading for the camp to bring back questioners. He rode the other way, toward the border, someone put in. Nassad lay just over the border. The Lord's captain, Gilad said, and Tron nodded. No child will let the questioners arrest you for what happened here, Damodred. Unless his captain ordered it. Some of them would order it, I think. Angry muttering began. Men denying they would stand for such a thing, but Tron quieted them somewhat with raised hands. You know it's true, he said loudly. Anything else would be mutiny. That brought dead silence. There had never been a mutiny in the children. It was possible that nothing before had come as close as their own earlier display. I'll write out your release from the children, Galad. Someone may still order your arrest, but they'll have to find you, and you'll have a good start. It will take half the day for us an hour to catch the other Lord's captain, and whoever falls in with him can't be back before nightfall. Galad shook his head angrily. Trom was right, but it was all wrong. Too much was wrong. Will you write releases for these other men? You know Asanawa will find a way to accuse them, too. Will you write releases for the children who don't want to help the Shongshan take our lands in the name of a man dead more than 1,000 years? Several Terravanners exchanged glances and nodded, and so did other men, not all of them Amadisian. What about the men who defended the Fortress of the Light? Will any release get their chains struck off or make the Shongshan stop working them like animals? More angry growls. Those prisoners were a sore point to all of the children. Arms folded across his chest, Trom studied him as though seeing him for the first time. What would you do then? Have the children find someone, anyone, who is fighting the Shongshan and ally with them. Make sure that the children of the light ride in the last battle, instead of helping the Shongshan hunt Aiel and steal our nations. Anyone? The Karian named Warellen said in a high-pitched voice. No one ever made fun of Warellen's voice. Though short, he was nearly as wide as he was tall. There was barely an ounce of fat on him. He could put walnuts between all of his fingers and crack them by clenching his fists. That could mean Aes Sedai. If you intend to be a Tarmangaiden, then you will have to fight alongside Aes Sedai, Gilad said quietly. Young Bornholt grimaced in strong distaste, and he was not the only one. The R half straightened before bending back to his task. But no one voiced dissent.
It's not too bad of a night.
Warellen
Can't complain too much.
That he had never before considered the matter. I don't hold with the witches any more than any other man, the R said finally, without raising his head from his work. What was he
just staying warm and
but the precepts say to fight the raven, you may make alliance with the serpent until the battle is done. A ripple of nods ran through the men. The raven meant the shadow, but everyone knew it was also the Shongshan imperial sigil. I'll fight beside the witches, Araki Terravana said, or even these Ashaman we keep hearing about, if they fight the Shongshan, or at the last battle. And I'll fight any man who says I'm wrong. He glared as though ready to begin then and there. It seems matters will play out as you wish, my Lord Captain Commander, Trom said, making a much deeper bow than he had for Valda. To a degree, at least. Who can say what the next hour will bring, much less tomorrow? Gilad surprised himself by laughing. Since yesterday, he had been sure he would never laugh again. That's a poor joke, Trump. It is how the law is written, and Valda did make his proclamation. Besides, you had the courage to say what many have thought while holding their tongues, myself among them. Yours is a better plan for the children than any I've heard since Edwin Nile died. It's still a poor joke. Whatever the law said, that part had been ignored since the end of the War of the 100 Years. We'll see what the children have to say on the matter, Trom replied, grinning widely. When you ask them to follow us to Tarmangaiden to fight alongside the witches. Men began slapping their shoulders again, harder than they had for his victory. At first it was only a few, then more joined in, until every man, including Trom, was signaling approval. Every man but Kashgar, that was. Making a deep bow, the Saldaean held out the scabbarded heron-marked blade with both hands. "This is yours now, my Lord Captain Commander." Gavad sighed. He hoped this nonsense would fade away before they reached the camp. Returning there was foolish enough without adding in a claim of that sort. Most likely they would be pulled down and thrown in chains, if not beaten to death even without it. But he had to go. It was the right thing to do. Daylight began to grow on this cool spring morning, though the sun had yet to show even a sliver above the horizon. Rodolai Toralda raised his gold-banded looking-glass to study the village below the hill where he sat his roan gelding, deep in the heart of Tarabana. He did hate waiting for enough light to see. Careful of a glint off the lens, he held the end of the long tube on his thumb and shaded it with a cupped hand. At this hour, sentries were at their least watchful, relieved that the darkness where an enemy might sneak close was departing. Yet since crossing from Almouth Plain, he had heard tales of Aiel raids inside Tarabana. Were he a sentry with Aiel perhaps about, he would grow extra eyes. Peculiar that the country was not milling like a kicked anthill over those Aiel. Peculiar and perhaps ominous. There were plenty of armed men to be found, Seanchan and Tarabanners sworn to them, and hordes of Seanchan building farms and even villages. But reaching this far had been almost too easy. Today, the easiness ended. Behind him among the trees, horses stamped impatiently. The 100 Damani with him were quiet, except for an occasional creak of saddle leather as a man shifted his seat. But he could feel their tension. He wished he had twice as many. 5 times. In the beginning, it had seemed a gesture of good faith that he himself would ride with a force mainly composed of Tarabanners. He was no longer certain that had been the right decision. It was too late for recriminations in any event. Halfway between El Nor and the Amadisian border, Sarana sat in a flat grassy valley among forested hills with at least a mile to the trees in any direction save his, and a small, reed-fringed lake fed by 2 wide streams lay between him and the village. Not a place that could be surprised by daylight. It had been sizable before the Seanchan came, the stopping point for the merchant trains heading east, over a dozen inns and nearly as many streets. Village folk were already getting about their day's tasks, women balancing baskets on their heads as they glided down the village streets, and others starting the fires under laundry kettles behind their houses, men striding along toward their workplaces, sometimes pausing to exchange a few words. A normal morning, with children already running and playing, rolling hoops and tossing bean bags among the throng. The clang of a smithy rose, dim with the distance. The smoke from breakfast fires was fading at the chimneys. As far as he could see, no one in Sarana gave a second glance to the 3 pairs of sentries with bright stripes painted across their breastplates, walking their horses back and forth perhaps a quarter of a mile out. The lake, considerably wider than the village, shielded the 4th side effectively. It seemed the sentries were an accepted matter of every day, and so was the Seanchan camp that had swollen Sarana to more than twice its former size. Ataralda shook his head slightly. He would not have placed the camp cheek by jowl with the village that way. The rooftops of Sarana were all tile, red or green or blue, but the buildings themselves were wooden. A fire in the town could spread all too easily into the camp, where canvas store tents the size of large houses far outnumbered the smaller tents where men slept, and great stacks of barrels and casks and crates covered twice as much ground as all the tents combined. Keeping light-fingered villagers out would be all but impossible. Every town had a few tick birds who picked up anything they thought they could get away with, and even somewhat more honest men might be tempted by the proximity. The location did mean a shorter distance to haul water from the lake, and a shorter distance for soldiers to walk to reach the ale and wine in the village when off duty. But it suggested a commander who kept slack discipline. Slack discipline or not, there was activity in the camp.
A new book.
Soldiers' hours made farmers' hours seem restful. Men were checking the animals in the long.
How you doing today, Fire?
Bannermen checking soldiers standing in ranks. Hundreds
I
of
got
laborers loading
my brother's
unloading
fishing
wagons,
chair. It's actually a little
drones
rocker
harnessing
too.
teams. Every day, trains of wagons
But it
came
sure
down the road into
beats
the
having
camp
to sit on the
from
floor.
west, and others departed. He admired the Shonchan efficiency at making sure their soldiers had what they needed when and where it was needed. Dragons sworn here in Terabon, most sour-faced men who believed their dreams snuffed out by the Shonchan have been willing to tell what they knew, if not to ride with him. That camp contained everything from boots to swords, arrows to horseshoes to water flasks, enough to outfit thousands of men from the ground up. They would feel its loss. He lowered the looking glass to brush a buzzing green fly away from his face. Two replaced it almost at once. Terabon teemed with flies. Did they always come so early here? They would just have begun hatching at home by the time he reached Aragamon again. If he did. No ill thoughts. When he did.
Hell yeah.
Thompson would be displeased otherwise, and it was seldom wise to displease her.
Hell yeah, fire.
Most of the men down there were hired workmen, not soldiers, and only 100 or so of those Shonchan. Still, a company of 300 Teraboners in stripe-painted armor had ridden in at noon the day before, more than doubling their numbers and requiring him to change his plans. Another party of Teraboners, as large, had entered the camp at sunset, just in time to eat and bed down wherever they could lay their blankets. Candles and lamp oil were luxuries for soldiers. There was one of those leashed women, the Bimani, in the camp, too. He wished he could have waited until she'd left. They must have been taking her elsewhere. What use for Bimani as a camp? But today was the appointed day, and he could not afford to give the Teraboners reason to claim he was holding back. Some would snatch at any reason to go their own way. He knew they would not follow him much longer, yet he needed to hold as many as he could for a few days more. Shifting his gaze to the west, he did not bother with the looking glass. "Now," he whispered, as though at his command 200 men with mail veils across their faces galloped out of the trees, and immediately halted, cavorting and jockeying for place, brandishing steel-tipped lances while their leader raced up and down before them, gesturing wildly in an obvious effort to establish some semblance of order. At this distance, Geraldo could not have made out faces even with the glass, but he could imagine the fury on Tourne-Lanacier's features at playing out this charade. The stocky dragon-sworn burned to close with Shonchan, any Shonchan. It had been difficult to dissuade him from striking the day they crossed the border. Yesterday, he had been visibly overjoyed finally to scrape the hated stripes indicating loyalty to the Shonchan from his breastplate. No matter. So far, he was obeying his orders to the letter. As the sentries nearest Lanacier turned their mounts to speed toward the village in the Shonchan camp, Geraldo swung his attention there and raised his looking glass once more. The sentries would find their warning superfluous. Motion had ceased. Some men were pointing toward the horsemen on the other side of the village, while the rest seemed to be staring, soldiers and workmen alike. The last thing they expected was raiders. Aiel raids or no Aiel raids, the Shonchan considered Terabon theirs, and safely so. A quick glance at the village showed people standing in the streets, staring toward the strange riders. They had not expected raiders either. He thought the Shonchan were right, an opinion he would not share with any Terraboner in the foreseeable future. With well-trained men, shock could last only so long, however. In the camp, soldiers began racing toward their horses, many still unsaddled, though grooms had started working as fast as they could. 80-odd Shonchan footmen, archers, formed into ranks and set off running through Serana. At that evidence that there truly was a threat, people began snatching up the smaller children and heading the older toward the hoped-for safety of the houses. In moments, the streets were empty, save for the hurrying archers in their lacquered armor and peculiar helmets. Geraldo turned the glass toward Lanacier and found the man galloping his line of horsemen forward. "Wait for it," he growled. "Wait for it." Again, it seemed that Terraboner heard his command, finally raising a hand to halt his men.
Oh shit, hell yeah,
At least
fire.
they were still a half mile or more from the village. The hot-headed fool was supposed to be near a mile away, on the edge of the trees and still in seeming disorder and easily swept away, but half would have to suffice. He suppressed the urge to finger the ruby in his left ear. The battle had begun now, and in battle you had to make those following you believe that you were utterly cool, completely unaffected. Not
Oh, since you hear fire, let's do it, Dad.
Emotion
But it's a
oozed from the commander into
little
his men.
fishing chair
Angry
slash
men
camping
behaved
chair.
stupidly, getting themselves killed and losing battles.
Definitely
Touching the
better to
half-moon-shaped beauty patch on his cheek, naturally
have it sit on the
especially
floor.
daylight. He took slow, measured breaths until certain that he was as cool inside as his outward display, then returned his attention to the camp. Most of the Tarabanners there were mounted now, but they waited for 20 or so Shonchan, led by a tall fellow with a single thin plume on his curious helmet, to gallop into the village before falling in behind, yesterday's latecomers trailing at the rear. Giraldo studied the figure leading the column, viewing him through the gaps between houses. A single plume would mark a lieutenant or maybe an under-lieutenant, which might mean a beardless boy on his first command or a grizzled veteran who could take your head if you made one mistake. Strangely, the Damani, marked by the shining silvery leash that connected her to a woman on another horse, galloped her animal as hard as anyone. Everything he had heard said Damani were prisoners, yet she appeared as eager as the other woman, the Sulda. Perhaps... Abruptly, his breath caught in his throat, and all thought of Damani fled. There were people in the street, 7 or 8 men and women walking in a cluster and right
I'll be
ahead of the
right
racing
back.
column that they seemed not to hear.
Oh,
thundering up
it's
behind
something
them.
until
There was no
I
time
get
for
my own
Shonchan
share.
to stop if they wanted to. And good reason not to try with an enemy ahead, but it looked as though the tall fellow's hand never twitched on his reins as he and the rest rode the people down. The veteran men, murmuring a
But
prayer
it-
for the dead,
It's a rocker
lowered the
too.
glass.
But we'll do it that
What
way.
came next was
Once
best
I get
seen
back.
without it. 200 paces beyond the village, the officer started forming his command, where the archers had already stopped and were waiting with knocked arrows. Waving directions to the Tarabanners behind, he turned the deer Bonacier to a looking glass. Sunlight glinted off a huge banding. The sun was rising now. The Tarabanners began dividing smoothly, lancets glittering and all slanted at the same angle, disciplined men falling into ordered ranks to either side of the archers. The officer leaned over to converse with the Sultan. If he turned her and the Damani loose now, this could still turn into a disaster. Of course it could if he did not, too. The last of the Tarabanners, those who had arrived late, began stretching out in a line 50 paces behind the others, driving their lances point down into the ground and pulling their horse bows from the cases fastened behind their saddles. Bonacier, cursed the man, was galloping his men forward. Turning his head for a moment, Giraldo spoke loudly enough for the men behind him to hear. "Be ready." The saddle leather creaked as men gathered their reins. Then he murmured another prayer for the dead and whispered, "Now." As one man, the 300 Tarabanners in a long line, his Tarabanners, raised their bows and loosed. He did not need the looking glass to see the Sultan and Damani and the officer suddenly sprout arrows. They were all but swept from their saddles by near a dozen, striking each of them at once. Ordering that had given him a pang. The women were the most dangerous people on that field. The rest of that volley cut down most of the archers and cleared saddles, and even as men struck the ground, a second volley lanced out, knocking down the last archers and emptying more saddles. Caught by surprise, the Shonchan Royal Tarabanners tried to fight. Among those still mounted, some wheeled about and lowered their lances to charge their attackers. Others, perhaps seized by the irrationality that they could take men in battle, dropped their lances and tried to uncase their own horse bows. But a third volley lashed them, pile-headed arrows driving through breastplates at that range, and suddenly the survivors seemed to realize that they were survivors. Most of their fellows lay still on the ground or struggled to stand, though pierced by 2 or 3 shafts. Those still mounted were now outnumbered by their opponents. A few men reined their horses around, and in a flash, a lot of them were running south, pursued by one final rain of bowshot that toppled more. "Hold," Giraldo murmured. "Hold where you are." A handful of the mounted archers fired again, but the rest wisely refrained. They could kill a few more before the enemy was beyond range, but this group was beaten, and before long they would be counting every arrow. Best of all, none of them went racing in pursuit. The same could not be said of Bonacier. Cloaks streaming, he and his 200 raced after the fleeing men. Giraldo imagined he could hear them yelping, hunters on the trail of running prey. "I think we've seen the last of Bonacier, my lord," Jollum said, bringing his grey up beside Atarola, who shrugged slightly. Perhaps, my young friend, he may come to his senses. In any case, I never thought the Terrabonners would return to Aragamon with us. Did you? No, my lord, the Talon replied. But I thought his honor would hold through the first fight. Atarola lifted his glass to look at Bonacieux, still galloping hard. The man was gone, and unlikely to come to his senses, he did not possess. A third of his force gone as surely as if that Damani had killed him. He had counted on a few more days. He would need to change plans again, perhaps change his next target. Dismissing Bonacieux from his thoughts, he swung the glass to glance at where those people had been ridden down and grunted in surprise. There were no trampled bodies. Friends and neighbors must have come out to carry them away, though with the battle on the edge of the village, that seemed about as likely as them getting up and walking away after the horses passed. It's time to go burn all those lovely Shonchan stores, he said. Shoving the looking glass into the leather case tied to his saddle, he had donned his helmet and heeled steady down the hill, followed by Jollum and the others in a column of twos. Ruts from farm wagons and broken down banks indicated a ford in the eastern stream. And, Jollum, tell a few men to warn the villagers to start moving what they want to save. Tell them to begin with the houses nearest the camp. Where fire could spread one way, it could the other too, and likely would. In truth, he had already set the important blaze, breathed down the first embers at least. If the light shone on him, if no one had been overcome by eagerness or given into despair at the hold the Shonchan had on Terrebonne, if no one had fallen afoul of the mishaps that could ruin the best laid plan, then all across Terrebonne, about 20,000 men had struck blows like this, or would before the day was out. And tomorrow they would do it again. Now all he had to do was raid his way back across better than 400 miles of Terrebonne, shedding Terrebonner dragon sworn and gathering in his own men, then recross Almouth Plain. If the light shone on him, that blaze would singe the Shonchan enough to bring them chasing after him full of fury. A great deal of fury, he hoped. That way, they would run headlong into the trap he had laid before they ever knew it was there. If they failed to follow, then at least he had rid his homeland of the Terrebonners and bound the demonic dragon sworn to fight for the king instead of against him. And if they saw the trap, riding down the hillside, Atarola smiled. If they saw the trap, then he had another plan already laid, and another behind that. He always looked ahead and always planned for every eventuality he could imagine, short of the dragon reborn himself suddenly appearing in front of him. He thought the plans he had would suffice for the moment.
The High Lady Suroth Sabel Veldaris lay awake on her bed, staring up at the ceiling. The moon was down, and the triple-arched windows that overlooked the palace garden were closed, but her eyes had adjusted so that she could make out at least the outlines of the ornate painted plasterwork. Dawn was no more than an hour or two off, yet she had not slept. She had lain awake most nights since Tuan vanished, sleeping only when exhaustion closed her eyes, however hard she tried to keep them open. Sleep brought nightmares she wished she could forget. Abu Dar was never truly cold, but the night held a little coolness, enough to keep her awake, lying beneath only a thin silk sheet. The question that tainted her dreams was simple and stark. Was Tuan alive or dead? The escape of the Ata Amir Damani and Queen Tylan's murder spoke in favor of her death. 3 events of that magnitude happening on one night by chance was pressing coincidence too far, and the first 2 were horrifying enough in themselves to indicate the worst for Tuan. Someone was trying to sow fear among the Friagel, those who come home, perhaps to disrupt the entire return. How better to achieve that than to assassinate Tuan? Worse, it had to be one of their own. Because she had landed under the veil, no local knew who Tuan was. Tylan had surely been killed with the One Power by a Sultan and her Damani. Suroth had leaped at the suggestion that I were to blame, yet eventually someone who mattered would question how one of those women could enter a palace full of Damani in a city full of Damani and escape protection. At least one Suldam had been necessary to uncollar the sea folk Damani, and two of her own Suldam had disappeared at almost the same time. In any case, they had been noticed as missing 2 days later, and no one had seen them since the night Tuan vanished. She did not believe they were involved, though they had been in the
This is
tunnel.
how
For one
Ozzy
thing,
and
she could
Snoopy
not
are laying right
imagine
now.
Rena or Sita uncollaring a Damani. They certainly had reasons enough to sneak away and seek employment far off, with someone ignorant of their filthy secret. Someone like this Aegean Tamara, who had stolen a pair of the Damani. Strange that, for one newly raised to the blood. Strange, but unimportant. She could see no way to tie it to the rest. Likely the woman had found the stresses and complexities of nobility too much for a simple sailor. Well, she would be found and arrested eventually. The important fact, the potentially deadly fact, was that Rena and Sita were gone, and no one could say exactly when they had left. If the wrong person noted their departure so close to the critical time and made the wrong calculation, she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and exhaled softly, very near to a groan. Even should she escape suspicion of murdering Tuan, if the woman was dead,
Let's slow the
then
fresh
she
dab
herself
up.
would be required to apologize to the Empress, might she live forever. For the death of the acknowledged heir to the Crystal Throne, her apology would be protracted, and as painful as it was humiliating. It might end with her execution, or much worse, with being sent to the block as property. Not that it would actually come to that, though in her nightmares it often did. Her hand slid beneath the pillows to touch the unsheathed dagger there. The blade was little longer than her hand, yet more than sharp enough to open her veins, preferably in a warm bath. If time came for an apology, she would not live to reach Shondar. The dishonor to her name might even be lessened a little if enough people believed the act was itself an apology. She would leave a letter explaining it so. That might help. Still, there was a chance Tuon remained alive, and Suroth clung to it. Killing her and spiriting the body away might be a deep move ordered from Shongshan by one of her surviving sisters who coveted the throne. Yet Tuon had arranged her own disappearance more than once. In support of the notion, Tuan's Der Sultan had taken all of her Sultan and Damani into the country for exercise 9 days ago, and they had not been seen since. Exercising Damani did not require 9 days, and just today, no, yesterday now by a good few hours, Suroth had learned that the captain of Tuan's bodyguard also had left the city 9 days ago with a sizable contingent of his men, and not returned. That was too much for
Do
coincidence,
another
and
dab in
very
just
nearly
a second.
near enough for hope, at least. Each of those previous disappearances, however, had been part of Tuan's campaign to win the approval of the Empress, might she live forever, and be named heir. Each time, some competitor among her sisters had been forced or emboldened to acts that lowered her when Tuan reappeared. What need had she of such stratagems now, here? Rack her brains how she would, Suroth could not find a worthy target outside Shongshan. She had considered the possibility that she herself was the mark, but only briefly, and only because she could think of no one else. Tuan could have stripped her of her position in the return with 3 words. All she needed to do was remove the veil. Here, the daughter of the 9 moons, in command of the return, spoke with the voice of the Empire. Their suspicion that Suroth was Ata'an Shadar, what those this side of the Arith Ocean called a dark friend, might have been enough for Tuan to have handed her over to the Seekers for questioning. No, Tuan was aiming at someone else, or something else, if she did still live. But she had to. Suroth did not want to die. She fingered the blade. Who or what else did not matter, except as a clue to where Tuan might be, but that was very important, immensely so. Already, despite the announcement of an extended inspection trip, whispers floated among the blood that she was dead. The longer she remained missing, the more those whispers would grow, and with them the pressure for Suroth to return to Shandar and make that apology. She could only resist so long before she would be adjudged Simosief so deeply that only her own servants and property would obey her. Her eyes would be ground into the dirt. Low blood as well as high, perhaps even commoners would refuse to speak to her. Soon after that, she would find herself on a ship, whatever her wishes. Without doubt, Tuon would be displeased at being found, yet it seemed unlikely her displeasure would extend so far as Suroth being dishonored and forced to slit her wrists. Therefore Tuon must be found. Every seeker in Altara was searching for her, those Suroth knew of at least. Tuon's own seekers were not among the known, yet they must be hunting twice as hard as any others, unless they had been taken into her confidence. But in 17 days, all that had been uncovered was that ridiculous story of Tuon extorting jewelry from goldsmiths, and that was known to every common soldier. Perhaps the arched door to the anteroom began to open slowly, and Suroth snapped her right eye shut to protect her night vision against the light of the outer room. As soon as the gap was wide enough, a pale-haired woman in the diaphanous robes of the Daco veil slipped into the bedchamber and softly closed the door behind her, plunging the room into pitch blackness. Until Suroth opened her eye again and made out a shadowy form creeping toward her bed. And another shadow, huge, suddenly looming in a corner of the room as Almandaragal rose noiselessly to his feet. The Lopar could cross the room and snap the fool woman's neck in a heartbeat, but Suroth still gripped the hilt of her dagger. It was wise to have a second line of defense, even when the first seemed impregnable. A pace short of the bed, the Daco veil stopped. Her anxious breathing sounded loud in the silence. "Working up your courage, Leandrin?" Suroth said harshly. That honey-colored hair, worked in thin braids, had been enough to name her. With a squeak, the Daco veil dropped to her knees and bent to press her face to the carpet. She had learned that much, at least. "I would not harm you, High Lady," she lied. "You know I would not." Her voice was rushed in a breathy panic. Learning when to speak and when not seemed as far beyond her as learning how to speak with proper respect. "We are both bound to serve the great Lord, High
Dabs
Lady.
up.
Have I not proven I can be useful? I removed Alwyn for you, yes? You said you wished her dead, High Lady, and I removed her." Suroth grimaced and sat up in the dark, the sheet sliding down to her lap. It was so easy to forget Daco was there, even this Daco, and
Just
then
I
to
mean
let
that
slip
it being a
things
rock,
she
I
should not
could
have.
guess.
Alwyn had not been dangerous, merely
But
a
that
nuisance.
actually stops like that,
Awkward
so I
in her
won't
place
tip
as
over it.
Suroth's voice. She had achieved all she had ever wanted in
Just sit
reaching back,
there.
and the likelihood of her risking it by so much as the smallest betrayal has been tiny. True, had she broken her neck falling down a flight of stairs, Suroth would have felt some small relief from an irritant, but poison that left the woman with bulging eyes and a blue face was another matter. Even with the search for Tuon, that had brought the seeker's eyes to Suroth's household. She had been forced to insist on it for the murder of her voice. That there were listeners in her household she accepted. Every household had its share of listeners. Seekers did more than listen, though, and they might uncover what must remain hidden. Masking her anger required surprising effort, and her tone was colder than she wanted. "I hope you did not wake me merely to plead again, Leandrin." "No, no." The fool raised her head and actually looked straight at her. "An officer came from General Galgan, High Lady. He is waiting to take you to the General." Suroth's head throbbed with irritation. The woman delayed delivering a message from Galgan and looked her in the eye. In the dark, to be sure. Yet an urge swept over her to strangle the Leandrin with her bare hands. A second death hard on the heels of the first would intensify the seeker's interest in her household if they learned of it. But Elbar could dispose of the body easily. He was clever in such tasks. Except avoid owning the former Aes Sedai who once had been so haughty with her. Making her a perfect Ducklevere in every way would be a great pleasure. It was time to have the woman collared, however. Already irritating rumors of an uncollared Marastamani among her servants. It would be a 12-day wonder when the Sultan discovered she was shielded in some way so she could not channel. Yet that would help answer the question of why she had not been reached before. Elbar would need to find some Afa'an Shadar among the Sultan, though that was never an easy task. Relatively few Sultan returned to the Great Lord, oddly, and she no longer really trusted any Sultan. But perhaps Sarah could be trusted more than the rest. Light two lamps and bring me a robe and slippers, she said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Leandrin scrambled to the table that held the lidded sand bowl on its gilded tripod, and hissed when she found it with a careless hand. But she quickly used the tongs to lift out a hot coal, puffed it to a glow, and lit two of the silvered lamps, adjusting the wicks so the flames held steady and did not smoke. Her tongue might suggest that she felt herself Surat's equal rather than a possession, yet the strap had taught her to obey commands with alacrity. Turning with one of the lamps in her hand, she gave a start and a choked cry at the sight of Almandaragal leaning in the corner, his dark, ridge-ringed eyes focused on her. You would think she had never seen him before, yet he was a fearsome sight, 10 feet tall and 2,000 pounds, his hairless skin like reddish-brown leather, flexing his six-toed forepaws so his claws extended and retracted. Be at ease, Surat told the Lopar, a familiar command, but he stretched his mouth wide, showing sharp teeth, before settling back to the floor and resting his huge round head on his paws like a hound. He did not close his eyes again either. Lopar were quite intelligent, and plainly he trusted Leandrin no more than she did. Despite fearful glances at Almandargal, the Duckovale was quick enough to fetch blue velvet slippers and a white silk robe intricately embroidered in green, red, and blue from the tall carved wardrobe, and she held the robe for Suroth to thrust her arms into the sleeves. But Suroth had to tie the long sash herself, and to thrust out a foot, before Leandrin remembered to kneel and fit the slippers on. Her eyes, but the woman was incompetent. By the dim light, Suroth examined herself in the gilded stand mirror against the wall. Her eyes were hollow and shadowed with weariness. The tail of her crest hung down her back in a loose braid for sleeping, and doubtless her scalp required a razor. Very well. Galgan's messenger would think her grief-stricken over Tuon, and that was true enough. Before learning the general's message, though, she had one small matter to take care of. Run to Rosala and beg her to beat you soundly, Leandrin, she said. The Duckovale's tight little mouth dropped open and her eyes widened in shock. But why? She whined. Me, I had done nothing. Suroth busied her hands with knotting the sash tighter to keep from striking the woman. Her eyes would be lowered for a month if it was learned that she had struck a Duckovale herself. She certainly owed no explanations to property, yet once Leandrin did become completely trained, she would miss these opportunities to grind the woman's face in how far she had fallen. Because you delayed telling me of the general's messenger. Because you still call yourself I rather than Leandrin. Because you meet my eyes. She could not help hissing that. Leandrin had huddled in on herself with every word, and now she directed her eyes to the floor as if that would mitigate her offense. Because you questioned my orders instead of obeying. And last but most importantly to you, because I wish you did. Now run and tell Rosala each of these reasons so she will beat you well. Leandrin hears and obeys, High Lady, the Dr. Vale whimpered, at last getting something right, and flung herself at the door so fast she lost one of her white slippers. Too terrified to turn back for it, or perhaps even to notice, and, well, for her that she was, she clawed the door open and ran. Sending property for discipline should not bring a sense of satisfaction, but it did. Oh, yes, it did. Suroth took a moment to control her breathing. To appear to be grieving was one thing, to appear to be agitated quite another. She was filled with annoyance at Leandrin, jolting memories of her nightmares, fears for Tuon's fate, and even more so her own. But not until the face in the mirror displayed utter calm did she follow the Dr. Vale. The anteroom to her bedchamber was decorated in the garish Evidari fashion, a cloud-painted blue ceiling, yellow walls, and green and yellow floor tiles, even replacing the furnishings with her own tall screens, all save two painted by the finest artists with birds or flowers, did little to relieve the gaudiness. She growled faintly in her throat at sight of the outer door, apparently left open by meanders in her flight. But she dismissed the darker veil from her mind for the moment, and concentrated on the man who stood there examining the screen that held the image of a quarry, a huge spotted cat from descent to jaw. Lanky and graying in armor striped blue and yellow, he pivoted smoothly at the soft sound of her footsteps and went to one knee, though he was a commoner. The helmet beneath his arm bore 3 slender blue plumes, so the message must be important. Of course it must be important to disturb her at this hour. She would give him dispensation. This once. Banner General Mihail Majira, High Lady. Captain General Galgan's compliments as he has received communications from Tarapon. Suroth's eyebrows climbed in spite of herself. Tarapon? Tarapon was a Securus Shundar. Automatically her fingers twitched, but she had not yet found a replacement for Alvin. She must speak to the man herself. Irritation over that hardened her voice, and she made no effort to soften it, kneeling instead of prostrate. What communications? If I have been waiting for news of Aiel, I will not be pleased, Burma General. Her tone failed to intimidate the man. He even raised his eyes almost to meet hers. Not Aiel, High Lady, he said calmly. Captain General Galgan wishes to tell you himself, so you can hear every detail correctly. Suloth's breath caught for an instant. Whether Najira was just reluctant to tell her the contents of these communications or had been ordered not to, just sounded ill. Lead on, she commanded, then swept out of the room without waiting for him, ignoring as best she could the pair of Death Watch guards standing like statues in the hallway to either side of the door. The honor of being guarded by those men in ragged green armor made her skin crawl. Since Tuan's disappearance, she tried not to see them at all. The corridor, lined with gilded stand lamps whose flames flickered in errant drafts that stirred tapestries of ships and the sea, was empty except for a few liveried palace servants scurrying on early tasks, who thought deep bows and curtsies sufficient. And they always looked right at her. Perhaps a word with Veslin? No, the new king was her equal now, in law at any rate, and she doubted that he would make his servants behave properly. She stared straight ahead as she walked. That way she did not have to see the servants' insides. Najira caught up to her quickly, his boots ringing on the 2 bright blue floor tiles, and fell in at her side. In truth, she needed no guide. She knew where Galgan must be. The room had begun as a chamber for dancing, a square 30 paces on the side, its ceiling painted with fanciful fish and birds frolicking in often confusing fashion among clouds and waves. Only the ceiling remained to recall the room's beginnings. Now mirrored stand lamps and shelves full of filed reports in leather folders lined the pale red walls. Brown-coated clerks scurried along the aisles between the long mat-strewn tables that covered the green-tiled dancing floor. A young officer, an under-lieutenant with no plume on her red and yellow helmet, raced past Suroth without so much as a move to prostrate herself. Clerks merely squeezed themselves out of her path. Galgan gave his people too much leeway. He claimed that what he called excessive ceremony at the wrong time hindered efficiency. She called it effrontery. Lunal Galgan, a tall man in a red robe richly worked with bright feathered birds, the hair of his crest snow white, and its tail plaited in a tight but untidy queue that hung to his shoulders, stood at a table near the center of the room with a knot of other high-ranking officers, some in breastplates, others in robes, and nearly as disheveled as she. It seemed she was not the first to whom he had sent a messenger. She struggled to keep anger from her face. Galgan had come with Tuon and the return, and thus she knew little of him beyond that his ancestors had been among the first to throw their support to Luther Paemdrag, and that he owned a high reputation as a soldier and a general. Well, reputation and truth were sometimes the same. She disliked him entirely for himself. He turned at her approach and formally laid his hands on her shoulders, kissing her on either cheek, so she was forced to return the greeting while trying not to wrinkle her nose at the strong, musky scent he favored. Galgan's face was as smooth as his creases would allow, but she thought she detected a hint of worry in his blue eyes. A number of the men and women behind him, mainly low blood and commoners, wore open frowns. The large map of Tarabon, spread out on the table in front of her and held flat by four lamps, gave reason enough for worry. Markers covered it, red wedges for Shanshan forces on the moon, and red stars for forces holding in place, each supporting a small paper banner inked with their numbers and composition. Scattered across the map, across the entire map, lay black discs marking engagements, and even more white discs for enemy forces, many of those without the banners. How could there be any enemies in Taramon? It was as secure as... What happened? She demanded. Bracken began arriving with reports from Lieutenant General Turan about 3 hours ago. Galgan began in conversational tones, pointedly not making a report himself. He studied the map as he talked, never glancing in her direction. They aren't complete. Each new one adds to the lists, and I expect that won't change for a while, but what I've seen runs this way. Since dawn yesterday, 7 major supply camps overrun and burned, along with more than 2 dozen smaller camps. 20 supply trains attacked, wagons and their contents put to the torch. 17 small outposts have been wiped out, 11 patrols have failed to report in, and there have been an additional 15 skirmishes. Also, a few attacks against our settlement. Only a handful of fatalities, mostly men who tried to defend their belongings. A good many wagons and stores burned, along with some half-built houses, and the same message delivered everywhere. Leave Tarabon. All this was done by bands of between 2 and perhaps 500 men. Estimates are a minimum of 10,000 and perhaps twice that, nearly all Taraboners. Oh yes, he finished casually, and most of them are wearing armor painted with stripes. She wanted to grind her teeth. Galgan commanded the soldiers of the return, yet she commanded the Karen, the forerunners, and as such she possessed the higher rank in spite of his crest and red lacquered fingernails. She suspected the only reason he did not claim that the forerunners had been absorbed into the return by his very arrival was that supplanting her meant assuming responsibility for Tuan's safety, and for that apology should it become necessary. Dislike was too mild a word. She loathed Galgun. A mutiny, she said, proud of the coolness of her voice. Inside, she had begun to burn. Galgun's white hue swung slowly as he shook his head. No. All reports say our Taraboners have fought well, and we've had a few successes, taken a few prisoners. Not one of them can be found on the rosters of loyal Taraboners. Several have been identified as Dragonsworn, believed to be up in Aradamar. And the name Rodel Igeralda has been mentioned a number of times as the brain behind it all, and the leader, the Damani. He's supposed to be one of the best generals this side of the ocean, and if he planned and carried out all this, he swept a hand over the map, then I believe it. The fool sounded admiring. Not a mutiny, a raid on a grand scale, but he won't get out with nearly as many men as he brought in. Dragons swore. The word was like a fist clutching Suroth's throat. Are there Ashaman? Those fellows who can channel? Galgan grimaced and made a sign against evil, apparently unconscious of doing so. There was no mention of them, he said dryly, and I rather think there would have been. Red-hot anger needed to erupt at Galgun, but screaming at another of the high blood would lower her eyes, and as that, gain nothing. Still, it had to be directed somewhere. It had to come out. She was proud of what she had done in Taliban, and now the country appeared to be halfway back to the chaos she found when she first landed there. And one man was to blame. Miss Aitoralda, her tone was ice. I want his head. Never fear, Galgan murmured, folding his hands behind his back and bending to examine some of the small banners. It won't be long before Turon chases him back to Aradamon with his tail between his legs, and with luck he'll be one of the bands we snap up. Luck, she said. I don't trust her luck. Her anger was open now, and she did not consider trying to suppress it again. Her eyes scanned the map as though she could find Ituralda that way. If Turon is hunting 100 bands, as you suggest, he'll need more scouts to run them down, and I want them run down. Every last one of them, especially Ituralda. General Yulon, I want 4 in every 5, no, 9 in every 10 Rockin and Altara and Amadisia move to Tarabon. If Turon can't find them with all that, then he can see if his own head will appease me. Yulon, a dark little man in a blue robe embroidered with black crested eagles, must have dressed in too great a hurry to apply the gum that normally held his wig in place, because he was constantly touching the thing to make sure it was straight. He was captain of the air for the Forerunners, but the returns captain of the air was only a banner general, a more senior man having died on the voyage. Yulon would have no trouble with him. A wise move, High Lady, he said, frowning at the map. But may I suggest leaving the Rockin and Amadisia and those assigned to Gunner General Kirdan? Rockin are the best way we have to locate Aiel, and in 2 days we still haven't found those white slopes. And that will still give General Turon the Aiel are less of a problem every day, she told him firmly. And a few deserters are nothing. He inclined his head in assent, one hand keeping his wig in place. He was only low blood after all. I hardly call 7,000 men a few deserters, Dalgan murmured dryly. It shall be as I command, she said. Curse those so-called children of my race. She still had not decided whether to make Asunawa and the few thousand who had remained Dr. Vale. They had remained, yet how long before they offered betrayal too? And Asunawa seemed to hate the Mani of all things. The man was unbalanced. Dalgan shrugged, utterly unperturbed. A red lacquered fingernail traced lines on the map as though he were planning movements of soldiers. So long as you don't want the tow rocket too, I raise no objections. That plan must go forward. Altara is falling into our hands with barely a struggle. I'm not ready to move on Ilion yet, and we need to pacify Tarabon again quickly. The people will turn against us if we can't get them safely. Suroth began to regret letting her anger show. He would raise no objections? He was not ready for Ilion yet? He was all but saying that he did not have to follow her orders, only not openly. Not so he had to take her responsibility along with her authority. I expect this message to be sent to Turon, General Galgan. Her voice was steady, kept so by will alone. He is to send me Rodel Ideralda's head if he has to hound the man across Aradamanen into the Blight. And if he fails to send me that head, I will take his. Galgan's mouth tightened briefly, and he frowned down at the map. Turon sometimes needs a fire lit under him, he muttered. And Aradamanen has always been next for him. Very well. Your message will be sent to him. She could stay no longer in the same room with him. Without a word, she left. Had she spoken, she would have screamed. She stalked all the way back to her rooms without bothering to mask her fury. The Death Watch guards took no notice, of course. They might as well have been carved of stone, which made her slam the anteroom door behind her with a crash. Perhaps they noticed that. Padding toward her bed, she kicked off her slippers, let the robe and sash fall to the floor. She must find Turon. She had to. If only she could puzzle out Turon's target, puzzle out where she was. If only. Suddenly the walls of her bedchamber, the ceiling, even the floor began to glow with the silvery light. Those surfaces seemed to have become light. Gaping in shock, she turned slowly, staring at the box of light that surrounded her, and found herself looking at a woman made of roiling flames, clothed in roiling flames. Alman Daragal was on his feet, awaiting his owner's command to attack. I am Semirag, the woman of fire said in a voice like a tolling funeral gong. Belly, Alman Daragal. That command, taught as a child, because it amused her to have the leopard prostrate himself before her, and it with a grunt because she obeyed it herself, even as she gave it. Kissing the red and green patterned carpet, she said, "I live to serve and obey, great mistress." There was no doubt in her mind that this woman was who she said. Who would dare claim that name falsely, or could appear as living fire? "I think you would also like to rule." The tolling gong sounded faintly amused, but then it hardened. "Look at me. I dislike the way you Shan avoid meeting my eyes. It makes me believe you are hiding something. You don't want to try hiding anything from me, Suroth." "Of course not, great mistress," Suroth said, pushing herself up to sit on her heels. "Never, great mistress." She raised her gaze as far as the other woman's mouth, but she could not make herself raise it higher. Surely that would be enough. "Better," Seminard murmured. "Now, how would you like to rule in these lands? A handful of deaths, Galgan and a few others, and you could manage to name yourself Empress with my help. It's hardly important, but circumstances provide the opportunity, and you would certainly be more amenable than the current Empress has been so far." Suroth's stomach clenched. She feared she might vomit. "Great mistress," she said dully, "the penalty for that is to be taken before the true Empress makes you live forever, and have your entire skin removed, great care being taken to keep you alive. After that, inventive, if primitive," Semirog broke in wryly, "but of no account. The Empress Radhaman is dead. Remarkable how much blood there is in the human body. Enough to cover the whole crystal throne. Take the offer, Suma. I will not make it again. You will make certain matters slightly more convenient, but not enough for me to put myself out a second time." Suroth had to make herself breathe.
Right back.
"Then Tuon is the Empress. May she live." Tuon would take a new name, rarely to be spoken outside the imperial family. The Empress was the Empress. Might she live forever? Wrapping her arms around herself, Suroth began to sob, shaking beyond her ability to stop. Almandarga lifted his head and whined at her interrogatively. Semirag laughed, the music of deep gongs. "Grief for Radhanan, Suroth, or is your dislike of Tuon becoming Empress so deep?" Haltingly, in spurts of 3 or 4 words broken by unmanageable weeping, Suroth explained. As the proclaimed heir, Tuon had become Empress the moment her mother died. Except if her mother had been assassinated, then it must have been arranged by one of her sisters, which meant that Tuon herself was surely dead. And none of that made the slightest difference. The forms would be carried out. She would have to return to Shandar and apologize for Tuon's death. For the death of an empress now, to the very woman who had arranged it. Who would of course not take the throne until Tuon's death was announced. She could not bring herself to admit that she would kill herself first. It was too shaming to say aloud. Words died as howling sobs racked her. She did not want to die. She had been promised she would live forever. This time Semirag's laughter was so shocking that it shut off Suroth's tears. That head of fire was thrown back, emitting great peals of mirth. At last she regained control, wiping away tears of flame with fiery fingers. "I see I didn't make myself clear. Radhanan is dead, and her daughters, and her sons, and half the imperial court as well. There is no imperial family except for Tuon. There is no empire. Shandar is in the hands of rioters and looters, and so are a dozen other cities. At least 50 nobles are contending for the throne with armies
Yeah,
of
little
defeat.
bump. Just 1
There is
second.
war from the Aldale Mountains to Salakay, which is why you will be perfectly safe in disposing of Tuon and proclaiming yourself Empress. I've even arranged for a ship which should arrive soon to bring word of the disaster." She laughed again and said something strange. Let the Lord of Chaos rule. Suroth gaped at the other woman in spite of herself. The Empire? Destroyed? Semirag had killed the assassination was not unknown among the blood, high or low, nor within the imperial family. Yet for anyone else to reach inside the imperial family in that way was horrifying, unthinkable. Even one of the Daconcian, the
You're
chosen
just
ones,
playing on
wants to become empress
well,
herself.
going through my
Even
Switch.
she
I
felt
ain't got no
dizzy,
games
with
on
a
it yet,
hysterical desire to laugh. She could
but it's
complete the cycle, conquering these lands, and then send armies to reclaim Shongshan. With an effort, she managed to regain possession of herself. Great
I ain't got no
mistress, if
games
Tuan
as of
really
yet.
is alive, then killing her will be difficult.
Gotta wait for
She had to force those words out. To kill the
GameFly
Empress,
to
even thinking it was
deliver.
difficult. To become Empress. Her head felt as if it might float off her shoulders. She will have her Sultan and Somani with her, and some of her Death Watch guards. Difficult? Killing her would be impossible in those circumstances, unless Semirag could be induced to do it herself. 6 Damani might well be dangerous even to her. Besides, there was a saying among commoners: the mighty tell the lesser to dig in the mud and keep their own hands clean. She had heard it by chance and punished the man who spoke it, but it was true. Think, Suroth. The gongs rang strong, imperative. Captain Musenji and the others would have gone the same night Tuan and her maid left if they had had any inkling of what she was about. They are looking for her. You must put every effort into finding her first. But if that fails, her Death Watch guards will be less protection than they seem.
One more little
Every soldier
dab,
in
and
your
then we'll
army has
smoke a
heard that
joint.
at least some of the guards are involved with an impostor. The general feeling seems to be that the impostor and anyone connected to her should be torn apart bodily, and the pieces buried in a dung heap, quietly. Lips of fire curled in a small amused smile to avoid the shame to the Empire. It might be possible. A party of Death Watch guards would be easy to locate. She would need to find out exactly how many Musenji had taken with him and send Elbar with 50 for every one. No, 100 to account for the Damani. And then, great mistress, you understand I am reluctant to proclaim anything until I am certain Tuan is dead? Of course, Semirag said. The gongs were used once more. But remember, if Tuan manages to return safely, it will matter little to me. So don't dally. I will not, great mistress. I intend to become empress, and for that I must kill the empress. This time, saying it was not very hard at all. In Favara's estimation, Sultana Rath's rooms were filled beyond the point of extravagance, and her own beginnings as a butcher's daughter played no part in her opinion. The sitting room simply stood on edge. Beneath a cornice carved with stone in white and gilded, the walls held 2 large silk tapestries, one displaying bright red blood roses, the other a calma bush covered in scarlet blossoms larger than her 2 hands together. The tables and chairs were delicate pieces, with more sufficient carving and gilding for any throne. The stand lamps were heavily gilded too, and the mantel worked with running horses above the red-streaked marble fireplace. Several of the tables held red sea-folk porcelain, the rarest, 4 vases and 6 bowls, a small fortune in themselves, as well as any number of jade or ivory carvings, none small, and one figure of a dancing woman, hands tall, who appeared to be carved a gratuitous display, no. And she knew for a fact that aside from the gilded barrel clock on the mantel, there was another in Tsutama's bedroom, and even one in her dressing room. 3 clocks! That went far beyond flamboyance, never mind gilding or rubies. And yet the room suited the woman seated across from her and Javindra. Flamboyant was exactly the word for her appearance. Sutama was a strikingly beautiful woman, her hair caught in a fine golden net, with fire drops thick at her throat and ears, and dressed as always in crimson silk that molded her full bosom, today with golden scrollwork embroidery to increase the contrast. You might almost think she wanted to attract men if you did not know her. Sutama had made her dislike of men well known long before being sent into exile. She would have given mercy to a rabid dog before a man. Back then, she had been hammer hard, yet many had thought her a broken reed when she returned to the tower. For a while, they had. Then everyone who spent any time near her realized that those shifting eyes were far from nervous. Exile had changed her, only not towards softness. Those eyes belonged on a hunting cat, searching for enemy or prey. The rest of Sutama's face was not so much serene as it was still, an unreadable mask. Unless you pushed her to open anger, at least. Even then, her voice would remain as calm as smooth ice, though an unnerving combination. I heard disturbing rumors this morning about the battle at Dumai's Wells, she said abruptly. Bloody disturbing. She had the habits now of long silences, no small talk, and sudden unexpected statements. Exile had coarsened her language, too. The isolated farm she had been confined to must have been vivid, including that three of the dead sisters were from our Aja, mother's milk in a cup, all delivered in the most even tones, but her eyes stabbed at them accusingly. Pavara took that gaze in stride. Any direct look from Tsutama seemed accusing, and on edge or not, Pavara knew better than to let the highest see it. The woman swooped on weakness like a falcon. I can't see why Katerina would disobey your orders to keep her knowledge to herself. And you cannot believe Tarna is likely to put credit on Elida. Not publicly, at any rate. Tarna guarded her feelings on Elida as carefully as a cat guarded a mouse hole. But sisters do get reports from their eyes and ears. We can't stop them learning what happened. I'm surprised it's taken this long. That's so, Javindra added, smoothing her skirts. The angular woman wore no jewelry aside from the great serpent wing, and her dress was unadorned, and a red deep enough to appear near black. Sooner or later the facts will all come out if we work till our fingers bleed. Her mouth was so tight she seemed to be biting something, yet she sounded almost satisfied. Odd that. She was Elida's lapdog. Sutama's stare focused on her, and after a moment a flush grew on Javindra's cheeks. Perhaps as an excuse to break eye contact, she took a long drink of her tea. From a cup of beaten gold worked with leopards and deer, of course, Sutama being as she now was. The highest continued to stare silently, but whether at Javindra or something beyond her, Pavara could no longer say. When Katerina brought word that Galina was among the dead at Dumai's Wells, Sutama had been raised to replace her by mere acclamation. She had possessed a very good reputation as a sitter, at least before her involvement in the disgusting events that led to her downfall, and many in the Red believed the times called for as hard a highest as could be found. Galina's death had lifted a great weight from Pavara's shoulders. The highest, a dark thing. Oh, that had been agony. Yet she was uncertain about Sutama. There was something wild about her now, something unpredictable. Was she entirely sane? But then the same question could be asked regarding the whole White Tower. How many of the sisters were entirely sane now? As if sensing her thoughts, Sutama shifted that unblinking gaze to her. It did not make Pavara color or start, as it did so besides Javindra. But she did find herself wishing Vihara were there, just to give the highest a third sitter to stare at, just to share them out. She wished she knew where the woman had gone and why, with a rebel army camped outside Tarvalan. Over a week ago, Juhara had simply taken ship without a word to anyone, so far as Pavara was aware, and no one seemed to know whether she had gone north or south. These days, Pavara was suspicious of everyone and nearly everything. Did you call us here because of something in that letter, Highest? She said at last. She met that unsettling stare levelly, yet she was beginning to want a long pull from her own ornate cup, and she wished it held wine rather than tea. Deliberately, she rested the cup on the narrow arm of her chair. The other woman's gaze made her feel as though spiders were crawling on her skin. After a very long moment, Sutama's eyes dropped the folded letter in her lap. Only her hand held it from rolling up into a little cylinder. It was on the very thin paper used for messages sent by pigeon, and the small inked letters, clearly visible through the page, appeared to cover it densely. "This is from Tashal Anderlik," she said, bringing a wince of pity from Havara and a grunt that might have been anything from Javindra. Poor Sashal. Sutama continued without any outward sign of sympathy, though. "The bloody woman believes Galena escaped because it is addressed to her. Much of what she writes merely confirms what we already know from other sources, including Tovain. But without naming them, she bloody well says that she is in charge of most of the sisters in the city of Kyrian." "How can Sashal be in charge of any sisters?" Javindra shook her head, her expression denying the possibility. "Could she have gone insane?" Havara held her silence. Sutama gave answers when she wished, rarely when he asked. Tobain's earlier letter, also addressed to Galena, had not mentioned Sashal at all, or the other two, but of course she would have found the entire subject beyond distasteful. Even thinking of it was like eating rotten plums. Most of her words had been devoted to laying the whole blame for events at Eliza's feet, however indirectly. Sutama's eyes flickered toward
What happened?
Javindra like
I was wondering, like,
daggers,
why is it
but she went
quiet?
on without pausing. Sashal recounts Tovain's bloody visit to Kyrian with the other sisters in the flaming Ashaman, though she clearly doesn't know about the bloody bonding. She found it all very strange, sisters mingling with Ashaman on tense yet often friendly terms, blood and bloody ashes. That is how she puts it, burnly. Sutama's tone, after discussing the price of lace, in strong contrast to the intensity of her eyes and her language, gave no hint of what she felt on the subject. Sashal says that when they left, they took flaming waters belonging to sisters she believes are with the boy, so it seems bloody certain they were looking for him and likely have found him by now. She has no idea why, but she confirms what Tovain claimed concerning Logain. Apparently the bloody man is no longer gentle. Javindra muttered into her teacup, but softly. Sutama disliked having a statement challenged. Havara kept her opinions to herself and sipped from her own cup. So far there seemed nothing in the letter worthy of discussion except how Sashal could be in charge of anything, and she would rather think of anything other than Sashal's fate. The tea tasted of blueberries. How had Sutama obtained blueberries this early in the spring? Perhaps they had been dried. "I will read the rest to you," Sutama said, unfolding the page and scanning almost to the bottom before beginning. Apparently, Sashal had been very detailed. What was the highest not sharing? So many suspicions. "I have been so long without communicating because I could not work out how to say what I must. But now I see that simply telling the facts is the only way. Along with a number of other sisters, who I will leave to decide for themselves whether to reveal what I am about to, I have sworn an oath of fealty to the Dragon Reborn, which is to last until Tarmangaden has been fought." Javindra gasped loudly, her eyes popping, but Pivara merely whispered, "Severe. It must be that." Taviran had always been her explanation for most of the disturbing rumors out of Carrion. Sutama read on, right over them. What I do for the good of the Red Aja and the good of the Tower. Should you disagree, I will surrender myself for your discipline, after Tarman guidance. As you may have heard, Ergine, Fatamed, Ronarla, Vivanios, and I were all stilled when the Dragon Reborn escaped at Dumai's Wells. We have been healed, however, by a man named Damer Flynn, one of the Ashaman, and we all seem to be restored fully. Unlikely as this seems, I swear beneath the light and by my hope of salvation and rebirth that it is true. I look forward to my eventual return to the tower, where I will retake the 3 oaths to reaffirm my dedication to my Aja and to the tower. Folding the letter again, she gave her head a small shake. There's more, but it's all more bloody pleading that what she's doing is for the Aja and the tower. A glitter in her eyes suggested that Sashao might come to regret surviving the last battle. If Sashao truly has been healed, Kavara began, and could not go on. She wet her lips with tea, then raised the cup again and took a mouthful. The possibility seemed too wonderful to hope for. A snowflake that might melt at a touch. This is impossible, Javindra groaned, though not very strongly. Even so, she directed the comment to Kavara, lest the highest think it meant for her. A deep scowl made her face harsher. Gentling cannot be healed. Stilling cannot be healed. Sheep will fly first. Sashao must be delusional. Tovane might be mistaken, Sutama said in a very strong voice. Though if she is, I can't see why these flaming Ashaman would let Loghain be one of them, much less command. But I hardly think Sashal could be bloody mistaken about herself. And she doesn't write like a woman having flaming delusions. Sometimes what is bloody impossible is only bloody impossible until the first woman does it. So, Stilling has been healed by a man. Those flaming Shonchen locusts are chaining every woman they find who can channel, apparently including a number of sisters. 12 days passed. Well, you know what happened as bloody well as I. The world has become a more dangerous place than at any time since the Trolloc Wars, perhaps since the breaking itself. Therefore, I've decided we will move forward with your scheme for these flaming Ashaman, Kavara. Distasteful and hazardous, yet burn me, there is no bloody choice. You and Javindra will arrange it together. Kavara winced, not for the Shonshan. They were human, whatever strange Terangreal they possessed, and they would be defeated eventually. Mention of what the Forsaken had done 12 days ago brought a grimace, though, despite her efforts at keeping a smooth face. So much of the power wielded in one place could have been no one else. To the extent she could, she avoided thinking about that or what they might have been trying to accomplish, or worse, what they might have accomplished. A second wince came at hearing the proposal to bond Ashima named as hers, but that had been inevitable from the moment she presented Tarna's suggestion to Tsutsama, while holding her breath against the eruption she was sure would come. She had even used the argument of increasing the size of linked circles by including men against that monstrous display of the power. Surprisingly, there had been no eruption and small reaction of any kind. Tsutsama merely said she would think on it, and insisted on having the relevant papers about men and circles delivered to her from the library. The third wince, the largest, was for having to work with Javindra, for being saddled with the job at all. She had more than enough on her plate at the moment, besides which working with Javindra was always painful. The woman argued against anything put forward by anyone save herself. Nearly anything. Javindra had been vehemently against bonding Ashima, horrified at the notion of Red Sisters bonding anyone almost as much as at bonding men who could channel. Yet now that the highest had commanded it, she was stunned. Still she found a way to argue against. Elida will never allow it, she muttered. Tsutama's glittering eyes caught her gaze and held it. The bony woman swallowed audibly. Elida will not know until it is too late, Javindra. I hide her secrets. The disaster against the Black Tower, Dumai's Wells, as best I can because she was raised from the Red. But she is the Amalan seat of all Ajas and Nund. That means she is no longer Red. And this is Aja business, not Hers. A dangerous tone entered her voice, and she had not cursed once. That meant she was on the edge of open fury. Do you disagree with me on this? Do you intend to inform Elida despite my express wishes? No, Hyde, Javindra replied quickly, then buried her face in her cup. Strangely, she seemed to be hiding a smile. Pavara contented herself with shaking her head. If it had to be done, and she was certain it must, then clearly Elida had to be kept in the dark. What did Javindra have to smile about? Too many suspicions. I'm very glad that you both agree with me, Sir Thomas said dryly, leaning back in his chair. Now leave me. They paused only to set down their cups and curtsy. In the red, when the highest spoke, everyone obeyed, including the sitters. The sole exception by Ajah law was voting in the hall, though some women who held the title had managed to ensure that any vote near to their hearts went as they wished. Havara was certain Sukama intended to be one such. The struggle was going to be distinctly unpleasant. She only hoped she could give as good as she got. In the corridor outside, Javindra muttered something about correspondence and rushed off down the white floor tiles marked with the red flame of Tarvalan before Pavara could say a word. Not that she had intended to say anything, but surely as peaches were poison, the woman was going to drag her heels in this and leave the whole matter in her lap. Right, but this was the last thing she needed at the worst possible time. Pausing at her own rooms only long enough to gather her long-fringed shawl and check the hour, a quarter of an hour to noon, she was almost disappointed that her one clock agreed with Sutama's. Clocks frequently did not. She left the red quarters and hurried deeper into the tower, down into the common areas below the quarters. The wide hallways were well lighted with mirrored stand lamps, but almost empty of people, which made them seem cavernous, and the frieze-banded white walls stark. The occasional rippling of a bright tapestry in a draught had an eerie feel, as though the silk or wool had taken on life. The few people she saw were serving men and women with the flame of Tarvalin on their chests, scurrying along about their chores and barely pausing long enough to offer hurried courtesies. They kept their eyes lowered. With the Ajahs separated into all but warring camps, fetid tension and antagonism filled the tower, and the mood had infected the servants, frightened them at least. She could not be sure, but she thought fewer than 200 sisters remained in the tower, most keeping to their Ajah quarters except for necessity, so she really did not expect to see another sister strolling. When Adelorna Bastine glided up the short stairs from a crossing corridor almost right in front of her, she was so surprised she gave a stop. Adelorna, who made slimness appear stately despite her lack of height, walked on without acknowledging Pavara in any way. The Saldaean woman wore her shawl, too. No sister was seen outside her Ajah quarters without her shawl now, and was followed by her 3 warders. Short and tall, wide and lean, they wore their swords, and their eyes never ceased moving. Warders wearing swords and plainly guarding their Aes Sedai's back in the tower. That was all too common, yet Pavara could have wept at it. Only there were too many reasons for weeping to settle on one. Instead, she set about solving what she could. Sutava could command Reds to bond Ashaman, command them not to
Yeah,
go
be
running to
right back.
Elida, but it seems best to begin with sisters who might be willing to entertain the notion without being ordered, especially with rumors spreading of 3 Red sisters dead at Ashaman hands. Tarn of Fayir had already entertained it, so a very private conversation with her was in order. She might know others of a like mind. The greatest difficulty would be approaching the Ashaman with the idea. They were very unlikely to agree just because they themselves had already bonded 51 sisters. Light of the world! 51! Broaching the subject would require a sister who possessed diplomacy and a way with words, and iron nerve. She was still mulling over names when she saw the woman she had come to meet, already at the appointed place, apparently studying a tall tapestry. Tiny and willowy and regal in her pale silver silk, with the slightly darker lace at her neck and wrists, Eukeria appeared thoroughly engrossed in the tapestry and quite at her ease. Pavara could only recall seeing her the slightest bit flustered on one occasion, and putting Taline to the question had been nerve-wracking for everyone there. Yukiri was alone, of course, though of late she had been heard to say she was thinking of taking a warder again. Doubtless that was equal parts the current times and their own present situation. Pavara could have done with a warder or two herself. Is there any truth in this, or is it all the weaver's fancy? She asked, joining the smaller woman. The tapestry showed a long-ago battle against Trollocs, or was purported to. Most such things were made long after the fact, and the weavers usually went by hearsay. This one was old enough to need the protection of a warden to keep it from falling apart. I know as much about tapestries as a pig knows about blacksmithing, Pavara. For all her elegance, Yukiri seldom let long pass without revealing her country origins. The silvery gray fringe of her shawl swung as she gathered it around her. You're late, so let's be brief. I feel like a hen being watched by a fox. Maris broke this morning, and I gave her the oath of obedience myself, but as with the others, her one other is out of the tower. With the rebels, I think. She fell silent as a pair of serving women approached up the hallway, carrying a large wicker laundry basket with neatly folded bed linen bulging from the top. Pavara sighed. It had seemed so encouraging at the start, terrifying and nearly overwhelming, too, yet they had appeared to be making a good beginning. Taline had only known the name of one other black sister actually in the tower at present, but once Atuan had been kidnapped, Pavara would have liked to think of it as an arrest, yet she could not, when they seemed to be violating half of tower law, and against many strong customs besides. Once Atuan was safely in hand, she had soon been induced to surrender the names of her heart. Kerala Sangier, a Damani Grey, and Maris Thornhill, an Andoran Brown. Only Kerala among them had a warder, though he had turned out to be a dark friend too. Luckily, soon after learning that his Aes Sedai had betrayed him, he had managed to take poison in the basement room where he'd been confined while Kerala was questioned. Strange to think of that as lucky, but the oath rod only worked on those who could channel, and they were too few to guard and tend prisoners. It had been such a bright beginning, however fraught, and now they were at an impasse unless one of the others returned to the tower, back to searching for discrepancies between what sisters claimed to have done and what it could be proven they actually had, something made harder by the inclination of most sisters to be oblique in nearly everything. Of course, Taline and the other three would pass along whatever they knew, whatever came into their hands. The ingredients took care of that. But any message very much more important than take this and put it in that place would be in a cipher known only to the woman who sent it and the woman it was directed to. Some were protected by a weave that made the ink vanish if the wrong hand broke the seal. That could be done with so little of power it might go unnoticed unless you were looking for it, and there appeared to be no way to circumvent the ward. If they were not at an impasse, then their flow of success was reduced to a creeping trickle. And always there was the danger that the hunted would learn of them and become the hunters, invisible hunters for all practical purposes, just as they now seemed invisible prey. Still, they had four names and four sisters in hand who would look like dark friends. Though likely Maris would be explicitly free to claim she now rejected the shadow, repented of her sins, and embraced the light once more, enough to convince anyone. Supposedly the Black Dogger knew everything that passed in Elida's study, and it might be worth the risk. Favara refused to believe Kaline's claim that Elida was a dark friend. After all, she had initiated the hunt. The Amarlin seat could rouse the entire tower. Perhaps a revelation that the Black Aja truly existed might do what the appearance of the rebels with an army had failed to, stop the Ajas from hissing at one another like strange cats, and bind them back together. The tower's wounds called for desperate remedies. The serving women passed beyond earshot, and Pavara was about to bring up the suggestion when Yukiri spoke again. Last night, Taline received an order to appear tonight before the Supreme Council. Her mouth twisted around the words in distaste. It seems that happens only if you're being honored or given a very, very important assignment, or if you're to be put to the question. Her lips almost writhed. What they had learned about the Black Aja's means of putting someone to the question was as nauseating as it was incredible. Forcing a woman into a circle against her will, guiding a circle to inflict pain. Navarra felt her stomach writhing. Celine doesn't think she's to be honored or given an assignment, Yukiri went on, so she begged to be hidden away. Sayerin put her in a room in the lowest basement. Celine may be wrong, but I agree with Sayerin. Risking it would be letting a dog into the chicken yard and hoping for the best. Navarra stared up at the tapestry stretching well above their heads. Armored men swung swords and axes, stabbed spears and halberds at huge man-like shapes with boars' snouts and wolves' snouts, with goats' horns and rams' horns. The Weaver had seen Trollocs. Or accurate men fought alongside the Trollocs, too, dark friends. Sometimes fighting the shadow required spilling blood and desperate remedies. Let Helene go to this meeting, she said. We'll all go. They won't expect us. We can kill or capture them and decapitate the Black at a stroke. This Supreme Council must know the names of all of them. We can destroy the whole Black Aja. Lifting an edge of the fringe on Kavara's shawl with a slim hand, Yukiri frowned at it ostentatiously. Yes, red. I thought it might have turned green when I wasn't looking. There will be 13 of them, you know. Even if some of this council are out of the tower, the rest will bring in sisters to make up the number. I know, Kavara replied impatiently. Helene had been a fount of information, most of it useless and much of it horrifying, almost more than they could take in. We take everyone. We can order Zera and the others to fight alongside us, and even Helene and that lot. They'll do as they're told. In the beginning, she had been uneasy about that oath of obedience, but over time you could become accustomed to anything. So, 19 of us against 13 of them, Yukiri mused, sounding much too patient. Even the way she adjusted her shawl radiated patience. Plus, whoever they have watching to make sure their meeting isn't disturbed. Thieves are always the most careful of their purses. That had the irritating sound of an old saying. Best to call the numbers even at best, and probably favoring them. How many of us die in return for killing or capturing how many of them? More importantly, how many of them escape? Remember they need footage. If just one escapes, then we won't know who she is, but she'll know us, and soon enough the whole Black Aja will know too. It sounds to me less like chopping off a chicken's head than like trying to wrestle a leopard in the dark. Fafara opened her mouth, then closed it without speaking. Yukiri was right. She should have tallied the numbers and reached the same conclusion herself. But she wanted to strike out at something, at anything, and small wonder. The head of her Aja might be insane. She was tasked with arranging for Reds, who by ancient custom bonded no one, to bond not just any men, but Ashaman. And the hunt for dark friends in the tower had reached the stone wall. Strike out? She wanted to bite holes through bricks. She thought their meeting was at an end. She had come only to learn how matters progressed with Maris, and a bitter harvest that had turned out. But Yukiri touched her arm. Walk with me a while. We've been here too long, and I want to ask you something. Nowadays, sitters of different Ajas standing together too long made rumors of plots sprout like mushrooms after rain. For some reason, talking while walking seemed to cause many fewer. It made no sense, but there it was. Yukiri took her time getting to her question. The floor tiles turned from green and blue to yellow and brown as they walked along one of the main corridors, climbing gently through the tower, around 5 floors without seeing anyone else before she spoke. The red heard from anyone who went with Tobane. Havara almost tripped over her own slip. She should have expected it, though. Tobane would not have been the only one to write from Kyrie. From Tobane herself, she said, and told almost everything that had been in Tobane's letter. Under the circumstances, there was nothing else she could do. She did hold back the accusations against Elida, and also how long ago the letter had arrived. The one was still Aja business, she hoped, while the other might require awkward explanations. We heard from Akura Vayet. Yukiri walked a few paces in silence, then muttered, "Blood and bloody ashes." Kavara's eyebrows rose in shock. Yukiri was often earthy, but never vulgar before this. She noted that the other woman had not said when Akura's letter arrived either. Had the Grey received other letters from Carrion, from sisters who had sworn to the Dragon Reborn? She could not ask. They trusted one another with their lives in this hunt, and still Aja business was Aja business. What do you intend doing with the information? We will keep silent for the good of the tower. Only the sitters and the head of our Aja know. Evangeline is for pulling Elida down because of this, but that can't be allowed now. With the tower to mend and the Shang-Chan and Ashaman to be dealt with, perhaps never. She did not sound happy over that. Barbara stifled her irritation. She could not like Elida, yet you did not have to like the Amaransi. Any number of very unlikable women had worn the stole and done well for the tower. But could sending 51 sisters into captivity be called doing well? Could Dumais Wells, with 4 sisters dead and more than 20 delivered into another sort of captivity to a Taviran? No matter. Elida was red, had been red, and far too long had passed since the red gained the stole on its staff. All the rash actions and ill-considered decisions seemed things of the past since the rebels appeared, and saving the tower from the Black Aja would redeem her failures. That was not how she put it, of course. She began the hunt, in theory. She deserves to finish it. Like everything we've uncovered so far has come by chance, and we are at a full stop. We need the authority of the Amaran Sikh behind us if we're to get any further. I don't know, the other woman said, wavering. All 4 of them say the Black knows everything that happens in Elida's study. She bit at her lip and shrugged uncomfortably. Perhaps if we can meet her alone, away from her study. There you are. I've been looking everywhere. Savara turned calmly at the sudden voice behind them, but Yukiri gave a start and muttered something pungent almost under her breath. If she kept this up, she would be as bad as Joacine or Tsutama. Siang hurried down to them with the fringes of her shawl swinging and her thick black eyebrows rising in surprise at Yukiri's glare. How like a white! Logical in everything and often blind to the world around them. Half the time, Siang seemed unaware they were in any danger at all. You were looking for us? Yukiri almost growled, planting her fists on her hips. Despite her diminutive size, she gave a good impression of fierce looming. Doubtless part of that was for being startled, but she still believed Siang should be guarded closely for her own protection, no matter what Saren had decided, and here the woman was, out and about, alone. For you, for Saren, for anyone, Siang replied calmly. Her earlier fears, Black Aja might know what work Elida had assigned her, were quite gone. Her blue eyes held warmth, yet otherwise she was back to being the prototypical wife, a woman of icy serenity. I have urgent news, she said as though it were anything but. The lesser is this. This morning I saw a letter from Ayako Norsoni that arrived several days ago from Kyrian. She and Tovain and all the others have been captured by the Ashaman, and tilting her head to one side, she studied them in turn. You aren't surprised in the slightest. Of course, you've seen letters too. Well, there's nothing to be done about it now, anyway. Pavara exchanged looks with Yukiri, then said, This is the less urgent, seeing? The white sitter's composure faded into worry, tightening her mouth and creasing the corners of her eyes. Her hands tightened into fists, gripping her shawl. For us, it is. I've just come from answering a summons to Elida. She wanted to know how I was
Oh yeah,
getting
it's
on.
definitely working.
Siang took a deep breath. We've discovered
Definitely a
and
lot
proved
more
that Alviaran entered a treasonous
comfortable and
correspondence with the Dragon
relaxing.
Reborn. Really, she was so circumspect in the beginning, so indirect. It's no
Live?
wonder I
Am I
misunderstood what she
do?
wanted. I think that fox is walking on my grave, Yukiri murmured. Bavara nodded.
Definitely
The notion
a
of
hell of a
approaching
lot more
Amida had
comfortable.
vanished like summer dew. Their one
Let's see
assurance that
here.
Amida was not herself Black Aja had been that she instigated the hunt for them. But since she had done no such thing, at least the Black Aja remained in ignorance of them. At least they had that still. But for how much longer? On mine, too, she said softly. Albiarin glided along the corridors of the lower tower with an outward air of serenity she held on to hard. Night seemed to cling to the walls despite the large stained lamps, the ghosts of shadows dancing where none should be. Imagination, surely, yet they danced on the edges of vision. The hallways were very nearly empty, though the second sitting at supper had just ended. Most sisters preferred to have food brought up to their rooms these days, but the haughtier, more defiant ventured to the dining halls from time to time, and a handful still took many of their meals below. She would not risk sisters seeing her appear flustered or hurried. She refused to let them believe she was scuttling about furtively. In truth, she disliked anyone looking at her at all. Outwardly calm, she seethed inside. Abruptly, she realized that she was fingering the spot on her forehead where Shaidar Haran had marked her, where the great Lord himself had marked her as
Hey,
dead.
Christopher.
Hysteria
How you
bubbled
doing?
almost to the surface with that thought, but she maintained a smooth face by sheer will and gathered her white silk skirts slightly. That should keep her hands occupied. The great Lord had marked her. Best not to think on that. But how to avoid it? The great Lord. On the outside she displayed absolute composure, but within was a swirling tangle of mortification and hatred, and very near to gibbering terror. The external calm was what mattered, though, and there was a seed of hope. That mattered, too. An odd thing to think of as hopeful, yet she would hang on to anything that might keep her alive. Stopping in front of a tapestry that showed a woman wearing an elaborate crown kneeling to some long-ago Amerlin, she pretended to examine it while glancing quickly to left and right. Aside from her, the corridor remained as barren of life as an abandoned tomb. Her hand darted behind the edge of the tapestry, and in an instant she was walking on again, clutching a folded message. A miracle that it had reached her so quickly. The paper seemed to burn her palm, but she could not read it here. At a measured pace, she climbed reluctantly to the white Aja quarters, calm and unfazed by anything on the outside. The great lord had marked her. Other sisters were going to look at her. The white was the smallest of the Ajas, and barely more than 20 of its sisters were in the tower at present, yet it seemed that nearly all of them were out in the main hallway. The walk along the plain white floor tiles seemed like running a gauntlet. Siane and Farana were heading out despite the hour, shawls draped along their arms, and Siane gave her a small smile of commiseration, which made her want to kill the sitter, always thrusting her sharp nose in where it was unwanted. Farana held no sympathy. She scowled with more open fury than any sister should have allowed herself to show. All Albiarin could do was try to ignore the copper-skinned woman without being obvious. Short and stout, with her usually mild round face and an ink smudge on her nose, Farana was no one's image of a demoni. But the first reasoner possessed a fierce demoni temper. She was quite capable of handing down a penance for any slight, especially to a sister who had disgraced both herself and the white. The Aja felt keenly the shame of her having been stripped of the keeper's stole. Most felt anger at the loss of influence as well. There were far too many glares, some from sisters who stood far enough below her that they should leap to obey if she gave a command. Others deliberately turned their backs. She made her way through those frowns and snugs at a steady pace, unhurried, yet she felt her cheeks beginning to heat. She tried to immerse herself in the soothing nature of the white quarters. The plain white walls, lined with silvered stand mirrors, held only a few simple tapestries, images of snow-capped mountains, shady forests, stands of bamboo with sunlight slanting through them. Ever since attaining the shawl, she'd used those images to help her find serenity in times of stress. The Great Lord had marked her. She clutched her skirts in fists to hold her hands at her sides. The message seemed to burn her hand, a steady, measured pace. Two of the sisters she passed ignored her simply because they did not see her. Estrella and Tassan were discussing food spoilage, arguing, rather, faces smooth but eyes heated and voices on the brink of heat. They were arithmetists of all things, as if logic could be reduced to numbers, and they seemed to be disagreeing on how those numbers were used. Calculating with Radun's standard of deviation, the rate is 11 times what it should be, Estrella said in tight tones. Furthermore,
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call it into this light for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone keeps stopping by. Definitely appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.